And all uppercase trajectory. Okay, why? Well, first of all, I'm going to do something really obscure, which is I'm going to take a page out of something that the very famous life coach Anthony Robbins does at the start of things, or after everybody's been sitting for a real long time. I want everyone to just stand up for one moment, just with enough room to stretch your arms out. Really, come on, just like this. And then with your feet parallel, straight ahead, your feet are parallel together, not together, a little bit apart, with your arms out like this. Just pretend you're driving propellers on your arms for 10 seconds. 1, 2, 3, faster, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now, that did something you probably didn't expect to have happen besides raise your heart rate a little bit. Just for grins, if you do that backwards, watch what happens to your back and your spine. Your head aligns differently and misaligns, but when you do it forwards, it actually realigns your spine as well as energizes you. And it actually increases blood flow and lymphatic flow to your brain, so it turns your brain up to another level. I do that every morning when I wake up, and then it all kind of goes downhill from there. So anyway, that's just to get everybody refreshed a little bit. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to be here yesterday to see what you saw yesterday, but I know enough about the curriculum, and I definitely know enough about Gigi that you probably multiplied your knowledge of entrepreneurship and startups by about a factor of 5 between Monday and now. So now I want to give you a little bit of a conversation and have a little discussion and try and be interactive. Anyone, number one, first ground rule, if anyone has a question at any time, just raise your hand or stop me if I don't notice you and ask it. The thing about this is a conversation about planning a business while configuring it to be not just fundable and not just well run, but much lower risk and therefore much more likely to succeed. Because in the eyes of every investor, in the eyes of the people you're pitching notionally on Friday, every investment decision is based on what's called an expected return function. Anyone know what that is? Anyone? It's just the product of the potential reward multiplied by the likelihood of success. Okay, so remember on Monday we talked a little bit, I mentioned that the startup ecosystem has an absolute failure rate of 92%. 92% of all startups fail, so 8% of startups succeed to some measure or another. So think about that in terms of how you pitch a business to an investor. So you're pitching this business that you want, let's just say you want £1 million for investment, and you're sure you're going to go to the moon and everything's going to be wonderful and you're going to create this, this £500 million business. The catch with that is that you might be right, but the way I have to think as an investor is basically 92 out of my 100 investments, or if you will, 46 out of 50, maybe in a typical venture portfolio, are going to fail. So you have to make up for it if you succeed. If you're coming in to pitch, my first assumption is that you're average, right? You're pitching to prove that you're better than average and that you're more likely to succeed. But ultimately, my risk and reward mentality, my expected return mentality is that if you think I need your business to return basically somewhere between 10 and 20x just for me to break even on my portfolio, because I'm losing money on most of the others. So I can think about that two different ways. You can either convince me how wonderful your business is, and you're learning to do that now, and you're going to do that on Friday, or you can show me how you have de-risked the opportunity and made it more likely that you're going to perform according to the numbers and the projections and the outcomes that you're projecting. Because both of those, reducing risk and potentially increasing returns, are a way to increase my expected return. So when I look at a firm, most investors, the sort of Silicon Valley, early 21st century model falls down to something we called originally the 3 T's: team, tech, and traction. And we talked a little bit on Monday about what those mean, and now we're going to dive in a little more. But the 4th T is something that that I'm going to claim is something that I didn't invent it, but I'm its biggest cheerleader, and that is this notion of trajectory. So let's talk about that. Oop, there we go, and we've got a clicker. So what are the 4 T's? Well, as we discussed on Monday, here's the thing. The T's are just convenient because it's nice to have something you can call 3 T's or 4 T's instead of, T, P, R, P, T, D, blah, blah, blah. That just doesn't look good. But in fact, each of them implies something much broader and much more important for you to think about in planning and presenting your business. So team is all about people, but it's also about the roles that they'll play and who else you're working with, your partners, other businesses that you interact with or that are part of delivering your product or service to market. Your tech isn't just about code or hardware, anything like that. It's about defensibility. It's about both your intellectual property, the kind you can patent and the kind you can't. There's a difference between what you can patent and what you might hold as a trade secret as a way of creating competitive advantage. But both of them play into your moat. Your business is like building a castle. Defending it from all attackers and marauders is building a moat around it. And your scalability is also an aspect of your tech. Usually that tends to be more related to tech-related ventures, but scalability is actually a crucial element of determining the value of a business. Why? Well, if I have a business that is basically a service business, then my scalability depends on the ability to add people. People aren't terribly scalable. and they're relatively expensive to scale and multiply. I can automate things along the way and improve on that, but basically service businesses are hard to scale. Because of that, they can't grow as quickly and efficiently just by adding more money. I mean, I can give you 10 million pounds to grow your business, but if you can't hire the people to deliver on a service, the money's useless. But on the other hand, if your business is software and you're delivering software as a service, SaaS, the acronym you all probably have heard, that's extremely scalable. So what does this have to do with whether I invest? Well, simple. One thing that affects my sense of whether it's a good idea is whether there's an outsized return relative to what I put in. Companies that provide services are usually valued at somewhere between somewhat 1 or even less than 1 times annual revenue, annual turnover, to sometimes 2 or 3 times, rarely more than that for service businesses. If you run a consulting business, that's about it. If you have a dental practice, that's about it. There's a certain amount of goodwill and other things that goes into it, but that's mostly it. SaaS businesses, on the other hand, are frequently valued at 50, even 100, sometimes more than 100 times revenue, because adding capital to attract customers has an extremely low, nearly zero cost of servicing those customers. So the returns are massive. So the more automated you are, the more scalable you are, or to put it another way, the less you are dependent on service, the better off you are. Traction, as we discussed, is all about market size and your uptake in the market. What is the size of your market? What is it today? What could it be in 3, 4, 5 years? So what's the growth rate? And this is an interesting aspect of building businesses with technology and innovating your way into a new market. Is it's very hard to predict what will happen to your market if your innovation works out or doesn't work out, because sometimes you're delivering something that no one's ever seen before or no one's ever bought before quite in that way. So things can happen that are really good. You can assess a growth rate and your ability to capture that market. So, and basically, if you think about how startups grow, there are really just 3 ways to grow. One way is called organic growth. In other words, you do what you do and you do a little bit of marketing and customers kind of trickle in. And if you do a good job, that can go on forever and your business can grow by 4, 5, 10% a year, kind of growing along with the market with a little bit of extra awareness. Second way is with capital leverage, investment. You can get capital either by giving away equity or borrowing it, or sometimes doing something that does neither, which we'll talk about in a moment, and do a lot more marketing to draw in a lot more customers. There's a rule of thumb at least in the SaaS business and in the marketing growth business, that if you're going from having no brand equity and no brand recognition and you're trying to establish a footprint in a market, you have to spend about 30% of your gross top line revenue on marketing in order to be able to establish a footprint. And once you've got an established brand, you can reduce that somewhat to maybe 10, maybe 20%, somewhere in there, but at least 30%, sometimes more. So what then is trajectory in all of this? Trajectory is your path. It's your roadmap, and your roadmap has one crucial aspect to it, which will be mentioned on the next slide. The trajectory also is how you define, it's the vehicle, if you will, or the mechanism you use to define your business strategy, how you're going to do business, to articulate your vision, and how you're going to achieve a return for yourself and your investors. What's your exit strategy? So, first of all, I'll pause there. Any questions so far? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So is it like it is a
You just reminded me of a good story about that. So you're right. A lot of investors will look at low growth industries and think, well, if it's an established industry like groceries, okay, why grocery shopping, a business where large grocery stores operate on ultimate net margins that are only about 2 or 3% at the most, and it's very easy for something to happen to drive that percentage negative. That doesn't feel good to invest in. But one of the things, for example, that happened in the first dot-com boom was somebody tried to innovate that business to create a new way of providing groceries. A company called Webvan, founded I think in 1997, who looked out there and saw all of these grocery stores, which were just standalone grocery stores, and the business model was customers going to the grocery store, buy their groceries, put them in bags, and go and take them home. And very few businesses delivered. Webvan thought, hey, this is a great idea to innovate. We will go and buy a ton of delivery vans. They spent about $1 billion on delivery vans, and we'll do the shopping for our customers. We'll create a website that lets our customers decide what they want. I mean, this is essentially the precursor to other delivery platforms that exist today. But they made one fatal mistake. They thought, we can do this without even charging the customers more, without having any other charge. We'll be so efficient, we'll move goods so fast that we'll just win. So they spent $1 billion on buying a huge fleet of vans, deployed them all around the San Francisco Bay Area. You could see them driving all around, built the website, spent millions of dollars building the website, and started delivering groceries without even charging a delivery charge. How long do you think they lasted? Yeah, not very long. They were one of the first deaths in the first dot-com meltdown because they were literally just bolting on additional cost to a business model that was already really challenged. So you're right, and investors don't like that. If you're going to innovate something that's already there or create a new innovation, you want to drive towards making sure that it has enough of a margin without being uninteresting to customers that you can actually sell that. So yeah, absolutely. Good question though. Let me jump forward one. So before we jump into the details of the 3 T's and the fourth in particular, every business you start from scratch goes through different phases and cycles, and there's more than one way of illustrating this. I like this because it's compact. I used to have a mental and visual model that had 5 or 6 different stages, but these are really the major ones, right? The business starts with what you've been doing for the last couple of days: ideation, inventing, dreaming, doing a little idealist thinking, trying to figure out what to do that can be interesting, trying to identify a market. Then you're going out and developing right now, sort of prototyping in your head, which then turns to physically prototyping the business and its products, and developing that until you've reached a point of having an MVP, a minimum viable product or a minimum viable service, and tinkering with that and doing our observation of the market, getting some customers to maybe be your beta customers or really your alpha, your pre-beta customers. And that's an iterative cycle. But you get there, right? You get to a place where you are finding product market fit, and then you're really going to market, and then you're doing another level of product development planning. Whoops, there you go. You're focusing more and more on your customers and less on your prototyping. You're doing your research and you're measuring, and the business is proving that it can be sustainable. And then you kind of start heading towards nirvana, where you can operate in a mode where your primary objective is scalable growth, taking that business and multiplying it out, taking that profitability and multiplying it out. Now, one funny thing happens in here, by the way. Anybody who's taken a first economics class has probably heard and understands the concept of economies of scale. As you get bigger, you can operate more efficiently and things get cheaper for you. Costs go down, you can buy in bulk and that sort of thing. Startups actually don't work like that initially. They actually work the other way around. Startups go through a cycle where the first things that happen are they have diseconomies of scale. It actually gets more expensive to run and build the business per unit of product than when you started. And the reason is really simple, because when you start, you as founders are doing everything. The CEO is taking customer service calls because there's only one customer and they can do that. Later, when you have, your CTO is emptying the bins at the end of the day before they go home. All of the resources that you have are serving multiple purposes, none of which, or most of which, aren't really the most efficient use of their time, but they've got time on their hands and they don't have money to pay for someone else to do it. So you go through this process of dealing with those diseconomies of scale, and then one day you reach a point somewhere around here where the economies of scale can start to build up. But keep that in mind when you think about building a business as a startup, is that things do get more expensive before. They don't just immediately start getting less and less expensive. So there we go. Let me jump in. So why is trajectory so crucial to success? Because it's rooted in the thought processes that you have to go through in order to plan a business. Here's the thing. Where you are today about creating the idea for a business and ideating a business and where you want to go can only happen if you have a mental vision of where you want to go. So, simple geometry question. Does a single point in space define a line? No, it's impossible. You need at least 2 points to define a line. And once you've defined a line, that's a path from A to B, from where you are today, from where you want to go. So you need to define this out here somewhere. And moreover, for the business, the line's never really a straight line. It's never even really a continuous line. It's very often a bunch of different points along the way where you may have to pivot and shift and whatever. But overall, you can start here, establish a vision point out here, and then build in some milestones along the way that represent different stages of your business and align your business progress and everything about it, operationally, financially, and so forth, with your intended direction. In other words, the path you identify sort of coarsely, that roadmap, here I am at the end of the forest, on the other side of the forest is a cafe. At least now I have some idea which way I'm going. But then I'll look out a little bit and go, well, I'm actually going to be hungry before I get to the cafe, and I'll only be about a quarter of the way into the forest. So there better be, a water fountain and a snack, and a snack counter in there along the way. Think of that as money and other resources that you need to have along the way. But each point represents a milestone along that journey. And those are the pivotal moments, because I'm pretty sure you can count on less than 1% of all startups that don't have to pivot to doing things differently or to making a fundamental change in their business along the way. All of the decacorns you hear about didn't start out doing what they were doing. Google didn't start out thinking it was going to become $1 trillion company doing what it was doing with ads. Airbnb started out as a couch surfing platform, and now is the largest travel and lodging entity in the world. So think about the fact that you're going to have to define that path and treat each milestone along the way as the point at which you do several things. One is you assess where you are and make sure you're still kind of going in the right direction. The other is you may need to reach out to someone else for more money or people or partnership, or you may need to adapt your product. So you build those things along the way. In other words, the milestones are also your key points of accountability for building the business. They're also the key points of your adaptability and your agility. Well, your agility to adapt and change as necessary to make the business succeed are all things you want to be able to represent when you pitch. Now, just to be clear, I'm not talking about in a single pitch, in a single 5-minute pitch, you're going to do all of this. But you're going to establish that you do have a vision with that point in the distance that is credible and it maps to the idea that you have, so that your investors and your partners and your customers, if you're talking to prospective customers, and people who might join your team along the way, all are aligned with that. So, and the journey of capital links to these, including the amounts and the risks and the valuations, right? I mean, another analogy, if I'm sitting on one side of the Sahara Desert in a Volkswagen with a tank of gas, and I need to get all the way across the desert, I know I don't have enough gas, so I need to know where the gas stations are along the way, and I need to make sure that I have enough gas to get there. So, in other words, every one of the other 3 T's is deeply affected by this one. So once you've established a sense of trajectory, then you can go back and look at what kind of team do I need to build? How is it going to evolve, right? What kind of tech do I need to build? How is it going to evolve? How is it going to combine with greater function along the way? How is it going to integrate with other things and meet evolving customer needs? How is it going to scale? Most of the times, the prototype app you built over the weekend isn't going to scale to 10 million customers. So, and traction, how am I going to prove that I'm actually doing the right thing here by taking this journey, by attracting customers? Because I can't just keep taking in money or spending money that I don't have. I have to have accountability along the way. So I'll pause there. Any other questions? Does that raise any thoughts? Does anyone feel like they have? Yeah.
The desired position, and it's also the vision. But we have milestones on the way and different turns, unexpected turns. Would this vision change on the road?
Oh yeah, it probably will. Well, it'll certainly evolve.
If we call it a goal, yes, it can change. But if we call it a vision, it's at least for me, it's unthinkable to change your vision, like betrayed your beliefs.
Well, it's a really good question, actually, because I want to identify or talk a little bit about the difference between sort of the philosophical vision of the business and becoming, and in particular, the benefit of the business. For example, saying I want to build a business that makes it easier for people to wash their car. Okay, and then that may be rooted in something that I invented, that I came up with in my garage over the weekend. My vision of doing that for people is actually valid until I prove that it's invalid, or unless I pivot away and discover that nobody wanted it, or nobody wants what I have. Making it easier for people to wash their cars is a valid idea with a legitimate market. The thing that may change along the way isn't that vision, it's how it happens, the implementation of how it happens. Right now, one way that's easier is I could have come up with the idea of just having an on-call service, except that that's a service business, and then that's not as investable as, say, having a new scheme for allowing a homeowner or a car owner to simply use what they already have to wash the car. So, for example, I wasn't thinking of this when I started responding, but for example, a few years back, somebody came up with a product that allowed people to wash their cars, to do what's called a dry wash of their car. Basically, it requires nearly no water to do a complete and very thorough washing of the cart. It requires like a little bucket of water. You don't need to haul out a hose. It doesn't take gallons and gallons of water. And that boomed because it had a huge market. Everybody who lives in a high density urban area or in an apartment doesn't have the luxury of being able to wash their car and have water flying everywhere, but they could do this literally right in their garage parking space. And so that worked. Now, if you started with that idea, that's great. But if you didn't and had to kind of pivot into recognizing what the market needed, that might change your business along the way. But philosophically, the vision isn't going to change as often as the way you deliver on the vision. So, yeah.
There's usually some companies, as an example, they're focusing on solving some big problems, for example, like carbon capture and stuff like that. Later on, they notice because usually with environmental tech or clean tech, they usually have the issue of they're going to find a payer or a customer, and so they notice technology can be used in other areas like maybe cosmetic or something like that. And in that case, would that be because in a spiritual position, you become a company that solves a problem, and now somehow switch to something that is solving customer problems, not really for the same level of social impact. So I'm wondering, is this some sort of, I feel like it's a bit betraying the people who are working for that, but I'm not sure how this could be switching the narrative.
Well, it might not be as much of a switch as it seems. Or it might be a completely different business that's just rooted in the same innovation that the first business started in. And that actually happens a lot. It's not that uncommon. Think about, for example, the iPad. The iPad came along and was the vision of the iPad was a personal device that allowed individuals to have access to information and entertainment and whatnot on the move. Nobody expected that it would eventually become the single biggest selling point of sale platform in the world. The front end of it, if you go to just about any store or go to Stripe, and the Stripe terminals you see are basically one part iPad and one part something else, but fundamentally, nobody expected that technology nobody envisioned that technology to solve that problem, but it did, and it's a completely different business. So both can happen. Both can definitely happen. I think the thing in the startup world, and you're raising a really good point about keeping track of the vision and also not getting too distracted by it, is if you invent something that's foundational, that has a lot of potential different uses along the way, it's very easy to think and that you're now going to just take over the world. And that's a really defocusing thought. And it's really essential to kind of stay focused towards some reasonably achievable goal instead of something that's too grandiose to predict and to predict the outcome of, because unpredictability diminishes investability. But keeping it focused makes a huge difference. Anything else? Yeah. Sorry? That's a key part. That's a crucial part of the vision. It also encompasses the idea of an outcome, because there's also a business. So you can think of the vision as having a lot of different attributes. There's a functional attribute, the solution to a problem part. There's also the business attribute of what's the outcome, right, of this business. Is this a business that is going to just be me and a few friends and we're all going to make a lot of money and that's it? Or is this going to be, a multinational global multi-billion pound business? Both could happen, but it's a lot harder to get to the latter than it is to the former. On the other hand, the latter may be more investable at some point. The former may be just a really nice lifestyle, which is good. It all depends on what you want as an entrepreneur. A lot of entrepreneurs, especially technical entrepreneurs, forget that there's a happiness element in this that has to, as entrepreneurs, that you have to attend to. if you're doing something not just because you can, and not just because it can make money, but because it's a journey you want to take. And there's a point at which your role is going to change inevitably, right? Even if you're the founding CEO, you may not be the CEO later, because maybe you don't want to be the CEO of a 10,000 person company. That's just too painful. Maybe you want to stick to what you're doing. I had a business partner in one of my startups who, after about a year of development and being our head of technical development, because he was an absolute rock star coder, but we had grown to have 20 other developers, and he was now the VP of engineering. And he literally walked into my office one day and said, I just want to code. I don't want to do this. I'm spending 60 out of my 80 hours a week at this, just managing other people, and I'm miserable. So he went back to just coding. Well, he was also the highest paid coder in the place then after that. But the point is, my personal view is that this isn't just about making money or even achieving the functional vision of delivering product or delivering service. It's a personal journey, and you will always perform better when you are happy about the journey you're on. So just a thought. So how do you define trajectory? And the good news is this is actually the next to last slide. In case Gigi was wielding the hook back there. How do you do that? Well, we've talked about some of the different aspects of what's on the trajectory, and there are a lot of them. This is not the best graphic in that it's not intentional that they're linearized like this. They just happen to have been tied together in the diagram. There's identifying a market and a focus and a problem, finding the business model that is going to work for you, whether it's service oriented or whether it's software and SaaS, or and how you actually interact with your customers. Identifying a growth model. Remember, we talked about the three kinds of growth. Actually, I mentioned two, right? Organic growth, where things just kind of incrementally grow forever, which isn't always interesting to investors because they want to see the hockey stick. They want to see the point where they pour tons of capital into it and it just takes off. But organic isn't a bad thing to do if that's the kind of business you want to build either. It's reliable, it's predictable. Leveraged is what happens when you take in capital for growth. Viral is what happens when you get lucky. In other words, when the business actually comes to you by way of your existing customers in volume, and you didn't have to do anything for that to happen other than to create a really attractive offering. So in other words, it costs you nothing to go viral versus just doing what you do. Problem is, not very many things go viral, and it's certainly not predictable. There's defining what your deliverables are in terms of product. There's also the timeline. Couple of rules of thumb. Historically, investors think they want to see 5-year projections for how your business is going to grow. And you heard it from me, you'll hear it from others once in a while. 5-year projections are worthless after the 3rd year because they are completely unpredictable unless you happen to have a crystal ball, in which case there are much better uses for a good working crystal ball. So 3 years is a good idea. Yeah.
Free prototype and don't have any customers yet, and are pitching for the first kind of initial round of money. How would you do the projections? Because basically you could make any kind of assumption anywhere. So how would you do that?
So you're going to first and foremost identify your market so you can size the market, and then break it down into, have you guys already talked about TAM, SAM, and SOM? Okay, so TAM, SAM, and SOM, although there are lots of disagreements about what those three represent, I'll tell you what I think looking at them as a VC when I look at venture investments. TAM is it's total addressable market, but it's not the size of your market's universe. In other words, if you make a new kind of X-ray machine or something like that, right? your TAM is not the entirety of medical spending in the world or in the UK, right? That's just not the case. Your TAM might be all of the medical imaging marketplace inside of that. And it's so in other words, you want it to be big, but you also don't want to make it ridiculously overstated. I actually had one company, which ironically was mostly a service company doing environmental risk assessment, that came and presented a pitch that had their TAM earmarked as $120 trillion, which at the time happened to be the entire global GDP. And I just kind of went, no, they don't get it, right? So you identify in other words, you identify a larger market space and a subset within it. So the TAM is the larger market space. The SAM, the serviceable addressable market, is what your business, as it is currently envisioned to do and to grow into, could address in a in an extended time frame over the next 3 to 5 years. And the SOM, I think of serviceable obtainable market. I actually like to think of that as, what are you going to do with this investment, or maybe this investment and the next one? It's not what can you really be down the road, because what I want SOM to be is actually the most predictable, reliable first or second milestone along the way, so I can see that you're actually doing well and that will boost your valuation.
How would you then say, pre-prototype, the first year we achieve X amount, second year, because this is all kind of speculation. So what would you like to see from an investor's perspective?
I would like to see, most of the time I'd like to see a SOM that doesn't have 8 digits. Because it's probably not realistic unless you're doing something that has a 6 or 7 digit price tag, right? If you're selling something for a software by subscription for £50 a month, £600 a year, the odds that you're going to suddenly have, what does that work out to? 100 of those customers in your first year before you run out of money is near zero. The odds that you're going to have 100 million, forget it. It's not going to happen. In fact, there's a phenomenon that you mentioned, another phenomenon about what to present in your pitch, that also brings up what has come to be called in some of the angel groups that I'm a participant in, the Peter's rule of absurd profitability, right? Which is, never mind the diseconomies of scale. I see so many pitches where somebody pitches a business that does indeed have £1 billion or $1 billion market out there somewhere, but what they say is, we're going, in the next 5 years, we're going to be at sustainable large scale turnover. We're going to be turning over 100 million a year, and we're going to have 40, 50, 60% EBITDA net profit. And mostly they've arrived at that by just multiplying out their base costs. Well, and inevitably every single time, and this happens just about, you go to a pitch event, this happens at least once every time I see a pitch event. Somebody predicting that their business is going to go to the moon and be insanely profitable like that. 60, 50, 60, 70% net profit. And I ask them, how many publicly listed companies of the 30 or so thousand publicly listed companies in the world achieve consistent profitability in excess of net profitability in excess of 25%? Anyone? Zero. Visa and MasterCard are very, very profitable. So is Apple. So is Oracle. Oracle and Apple have been known, Oracle in particular, have been known to float around 20% EBITDA pretty consistently, which is amazing. But the point is, it's almost impossible. Why? Because if you are minting money that way so profitably, I guarantee competition will hit you or your customers will demand a better deal along the way. It just doesn't happen that way. So you have to be really sort of sensible and aware of what the market metrics are for a growth business. And this is one of the reasons why 5-year projections are worthless, because not only can you not reliably predict what your revenue is going to be, you also can't reliably predict what's going to happen to you in the competitive market space over that time frame. You can predict what you're going to do this year and maybe next year, and with a certain amount of good luck the year after. So, yeah.
You have a good idea, yes, and you have like big market,
Mhm.
but you realize that your idea will not take off like immediately, or
Mhm.
you know that it will not go a straight line. So you, in your 3 years plan, you will kind of already accounting for the period when you will go very low and then like slowly take.
So that actually happens a lot. For example, that happens in biopharma, in medicines, a lot. I mean, your average new medicine, like a new cancer treatment or something like that, can take many years of trial and error, still more years of trials, and usually $1 billion or more dollars or pounds of money that goes into it, and still when get all the way out this far and hit a brick wall and fail and just fall apart. That can happen. So the thing is, there's a certain kind of investor that's up for that. So, and you have to kind of identify them. If you have something that has a very, very long sort of lead up to being able to turn the corner and enter the market and scale and grow, that's where it becomes all the more important to have good incremental milestones, because the last thing you want to do is raise enough money to go from here to here, because you will give away 90% of your equity. But to go from here to here and prove that you've progressed, maybe that's 10% of your equity. And then when you get there, a next raise might be another 10%, and it'll get you here, and so forth. So stepping into it, I established my venture fund, the Seed Milestone Fund, with that name specifically around the idea of insisting that companies establish milestones along the way that represented inflection points where you could measure their progress and make it and identify whether it's worth it to give them more money. In other words, each step is reducing risk along the way, and thereby increasing valuation. So yeah, it happens, and it's a good question, because it also raises the issue of knowing who your investors are, who your investors need to be, right? I mean, venture funds, for example, typically have a defined 10-year life. Typically, there are some that have more and some that have less, but the typical average is 10 years. And what that means is that the investments they make in the first couple of years, they are hoping for an exit by about years 5, 6, and 7. So maybe that's not a venture play. Maybe that's something where you go look for more non-dilutive funding, like grant money from an innovation fund like Innovate UK, which you might want to check out, or something like that, so you can make some progress along the way until you're ready for the kind of institutional investment that isn't always as patient as you'd like them to be. So, yeah. Anything else? I think we're almost done. Yeah, almost done. Sadly, it's mostly true. Well, let me qualify that a little bit. Later stage VCs, absolutely, because they're putting in a lot of money and they need a lot of return, but they also need it to be relatively low risk. Seed stage VCs are at the point where they're still looking at most of their portfolio failing And so they just need everything to have a pretty significant multiple. It's an unfortunate truth that there's a bit of a triage question that I'm going to ask as a VC, which is it a really large market? And one of the reasons why that needs to happen also plays back into the question of team and tech and traction, because the reality is, if you've identified a genuinely large market that I believe is large and has a real need, at a certain level, I actually care a lot less about your tech or your traction, because that's going to change along the way. In fact, so might the team. But if that market is actually out there, that's interesting. So think of it as almost identifying your market. It's almost like a perversion of Steve Jobs' observation of identify your customer and the experience that your customer wants to have, and work your way backwards. This is identify a really big market, have a way of approaching it, but know that you may be doing very different things to actually win it over time. So yeah, if you don't have that mega market, you might still have a very valid innovation for a more niche market, which might attract other kinds of investors, angels who want to participate, funds that might want to provide grant money along the way. But the long and short of it is, VCs are basically lemmings. and they basically follow each other off the cliff looking for massive returns. Sorry, but true. Yeah.
Then you won't look into that.
If it's like a which?
If the sum is less than 100 millions.
Oh no, the sum can be the TAM has to be 100 million. The sum shouldn't be more than, at the end of the day, the sum probably shouldn't be more than 3 times the investment you're seeking, give or take, maybe 10x. Because if it is, then I'm wondering, how are you going to do that? Remember the benchmark of if you need to spend 30% of your revenue to actually establish a toehold in a market, that means you're probably only going to be seeing 3 times that in ARR after you've done so. Now, this varies by a whole 0 or more, depending on what it is you're doing, because some things grow a lot faster, some things can be serviced and delivered a lot faster, and some slower. But basically, SOM is all about what you can achieve with this and maybe the next round of investment, but not the totality of all the money you're ever going to need to build the business to exit. One last thing, because we've pretty much talked about all of these. We talked timeline, instrumentation, your progress measures, a little bit about capital. I think, Gigi, did you already talk about sort of the different fundraising instruments, like equity safes, whatever? Okay. Okay. Safes, or as I like to call them, wildly potentially unsafe. Well, equity's easy. Equity is selling a portion of your company in return for capital. And debt is easy. For the most part, basic debt is borrowing money to do what you want to do to build your business. Another form of debt is what's called a convertible note, which is basically a loan that could be repaid, but if not, it can be converted into equity at some future point. And the advantage and disadvantage, the advantage of equity is that it's beneficial for everyone in one sense. The investor has a stake in your business. You've sold a stake. You don't have an obligation to pay them back, but you've given away a piece of your company. Whereas with debt, if you take out a bank loan, chances are, if you're a startup, they'll probably ask for a personal guarantee. So if you can't pay it back, you're in big trouble. And a convertible note is still a loan, and theoretically, you can pay it back and never give up any equity, or you can simply elect to convert it into equity at a particular valuation. The practical matter of when those things get used has a lot to do with when exactly you can come up with a valuation for your business. Because what's the idea you all have for your businesses right now today? Well, maybe I'll give you all £1 million valuation because you all have good ideas. But I don't know. Maybe somebody here has one that should be worth 10 right now. I don't know. It's hard to tell until you've gone through a certain amount of proving. Safes. Oh, we could have an entire session, a whole. Yeah. Mhm. Mhm.
It's a more complicated question.
Yeah.
And I think you should stay for mentoring.
Yeah, no, you're the good idea. Yeah, I was about to say we could literally go on for a day about that whole model. Okay, we'll dive into that question in mentoring then. The one sentence thing I will say about safes is that they're a way of combining kind of the notion of an equity investment and a debt investment, except that you never have to pay them back. And that's a whole conversation unto itself about the pros and cons of that. So, any other questions? We're not talking about that. That's there to stay up as sort of a pointer during mentoring. Yeah. That's SOM. Sam and SOM aren't directly related to the investment you're seeking now. They're related to your ability to progress along the way. SOM is the one that's basically you're trying to convince someone that the result of giving you money is going to be measurable in a certain amount of market that you can capture. Yeah. Okay.
Bigs are not like a physics problem. You're gonna come up with a definitive answer, well, unless you're a Nobel Prize winner.
Yeah.
Identifying new physics realms.
Yeah.
TAM, SAM, and SOM is really meant to, like, for example, if you're a researcher in a new market someone doesn't know, and it sounds cool, but they have no idea what the market is for this. You give them the TAM, SAM, and SOM numbers to give them an idea how big the market is. If you're going after a market that people, like, so many people are like, oh God, games, just for kids. But then you give them a TAM of how much money people are spending on games, and they're like, holy shit. Like I'm reading an article about Elon Musk getting in a fight playing a game right now. Okay, so gaming is really big, but there's investors who've never played a game who don't know it. So the TAM, SAM, and SOM is really to give an indication of how big that market is that the investors don't know. And you can make it really big, like Peter said earlier, you can make some, like medical device, you use the TAM as the total amount spent on medical devices. And that's so big that it's not even realistic or relevant to what you're saying. So you just want to give some credible numbers that give them a sense of the market size. And then, the SAM is anyone who could potentially use your device. The SAM is what's the more specific one that you're going after. Like it might be all the people that use it in Europe. And the SOM is the share of market. What can you realistically achieve? Do you make sense? So when I did the calculation about Singapore and the internet provider I started, that was a calculation of what could I realistically achieve. Does that make sense?
And so these numbers are all estimates, just to give the investors a sense of how big the market is and what you're targeting. Okay, and then what Peter just gave you is a rule of thumb that he uses as an investor. But that may not be the rule.
Yeah, it's definitely not everybody's rule. Yeah.
So just keep this as a data point of one investor, and then you keep talking to more and you figure out where do you want to operate in the market of investments. Are we trying to do a $1 billion company, we're going after $1 billion, or maybe right now we're just targeting this. So don't get too caught up in exactness, because
Yeah.
fundraising is not an exact sport, and it's definitely not, mathematics where you can come up with an answer that's right or wrong. Make sense?
Yeah, no, it's neither art nor science, and Gigi's absolutely right, because part of this whole process isn't to define things in some physical way that you can then set out and do a scientific experiment to prove. Yeah, I'll get to you in 2 seconds. It's to establish your credibility as someone worthy of the investment and worthy of the confidence that you've thought things through. It doesn't mean that your thoughts have been perfect, but it means that you have thought through. You've established an idea, you've established a journey, you can represent it, and oh, by the way, you're probably showing that you can also be flexible. I mean, there are a lot of non-numeric, non-objective things that that investors look for. Coachability is one of them, for example. If without it, they worry that you might not be able to be talked into pivoting, things like that. So there are a lot of other non-numerical aspects that make a huge difference. There was one last question here, I think, before we probably have to jump into. That is totally art, not science, at the stage that you're at. And there are a lot of different ways. If you're starting out with literally just an idea, this is actually where Tam, Sam, and Sam become important, because right now, today, I might use one of several different ways of valuing your business. One is market based. So if you've convinced me of your TAM, for example, and convinced me that in 5 years you could have a reasonable position, owning 10% of that TAM, then I'm going to discount that backwards to a net present value for evaluation. I might also look around and say, well, they're doing something in a market that has other competitors that are maybe doing things differently, and you've got a better mousetrap, but I can look at what those companies are valued at and what they've been acquired for, or what they were valued at in previous rounds. Put that into the mix. There are a bunch of different ways. I'm usually going to use 2 or 3 different valuation models and average them in some way. But frankly, at this early stage, and what happens a lot in the way venture capital is distributed and bought and sold, if you will, between entrepreneurs and investors, is it's very often FOMO. This is what happened to my fund, going from, we started raising the fund at the beginning of 2020, right before the pandemic. That was fun, calling a bunch of strangers on Zoom and asking them for $1 million just as investors. And by 2022, as we were just about to do our first close on the fund and bring money in, what had happened in the venture ecosystem was there was so much pent-up capital, dry powder is the term we use, in the venture world, and not that many more deals. It was kind of like going on a safari and waking up one morning and there are 10 times as many lions on the Serengeti, but only the same number of antelopes. Every deal was being bid up by a factor of 3 times or 4 times what it really should have been worth. And there was no rational rhyme or reason for that, except that all of these funds had to deploy their money because leaving it under, in the bank is like sticking it under the mattress. It basically degrades the performance of your fund. That can happen. That's happened several times. It happened in the first .com boom. It happened leading into 2007-8. It happened again in 21 and 22. So It's the answer is there are a lot of different answers. So oh yeah.
I mean, do they have like the same situation as they need to invest, not to keep this money under?
Well, right now, 2 years since the last meltdown from early 22 into mid 23, what's happened is there's still a lot of capital, but I think most investors have been chastened to the point where they're not going to do anything stupid, or they're going to do fewer stupid things, and as in throwing money at things regardless of valuation just to get in. But there is a lot of capital. There is still about 8 trillion in free capital for this stage of investment worldwide, which is a hell of a lot of money. And mhm. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. No, I didn't tell them.
Okay, that's important. Because who has watched Shark Tank? Okay, Shark Tank is wrong. It is wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, and what I mean by it's wrong is they say, oh, I want to raise $100,000 for 10% of my company. You do not do that. Investors do the valuation with some sort of
Model, yeah, or of
and
their.
they use different models. And if you're raising money, you do your financials and you see the first year you are short 500,000. You're going to operate negative. Where does that 500,000 come from? The investors or yourself? Okay, and then in that case, you're the investor. You know you need 500,000, but you do not say, I want 500,000 for 10% of my company, because you're telling the valuation. I want 500,000 for 10% of my company. How much is you saying your company is worth? 5 million. So here's what happens. If the investor thinks your company is nowhere near 5 million, it's really only 1 million, they say, these founders are full of shit.
Yeah, pass. Yeah, yeah.
They're way better than they are. And we don't want to deal with founders who are too big for their britches. Okay? Now, on the flip side, you're saying 500,000 for 10%, and the investor thinks your company's actually worth 20 million. And you're going to give them 10% for 500,000. They're like, oh, this is a good deal. These are a bunch of suckers. So either way, you're screwed unless you can hit right on the head what the investor thinks. So you just tell them how much you need, and they come back to you with an offer. And hopefully you have, advisors, you've talked to people, and you have a sense of how much you think it's worth. But the investor makes the first offer, and then you start negotiating.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
And do you know what? So Shark Tank says this 10% just because it fits into a 1 hour show.
Yeah. Well, and there's one thing that ties into that can actually cause a really weird and unexpected and sometimes awful outcome. That second scenario where the investment that Gigi just described, where the investor, you're saying, I want 500,000 for 10% of my company, but the investor thinks these guys have a tiger by the tail. They're actually worth 20 million. One of the other things that can happen that does happen that's interesting is they'll say, I'll give you $1 million for 20% of your company. Same valuation, right? But they think it's huge and they want more of it. It actually turns out to be a really, and I learned this the hard way from the first venture investor in my first venture-backed startup, that sometimes they go in with two things on their mind. Obviously, they want to make a good investment. They want a good deal. They want it to be a good valuation, but they also have a sense of how much of the company they want to own and how much control they want. I literally had that VC that invested in our initial round over one too many martinis literally say, it really didn't matter how much we invested. We just wanted to own this much of the company. Yeah.
Once they took over 20-30%, they took over more.
Yeah.
And then they basically took the CEO out because their whole goal was actually to own and run the company.
Yeah.
Not support the start, not support the founder. So there's a lot. Oh my God, we could fill this up.
There are a lot of war stories. Yeah.
We have a deadline on Friday to present cohesive pitches. And
Good. Cheers.